This is how I got fluent in French at last. I started learning French in uni. I had 4 years of classes, which were extremely inefficient and boring. It was very traditional, lots of grammar, conjugations, lots of theory, uh, all that stuff that is boring and doesn't work. And at the end of the 4 year period, I managed to pass my exams, but I couldn't speak any French, couldn't understand much either, and I actually hated the language because I just my mind associated it with pain, with having to sit down in class and study grammar for exams and things like that, and not anything really fun or any kind of pleasure really. That changed sometime later when um, I started. By chance, I started watching French TV. Uh, I think it was just on, and I started listening to it. I live near the French border, a half an hour drive. So yeah, we've got French channels here. And French TV was on, so I started listening to it. I think it was the news, and I could understand a little bit uh, of some words here and there. So I started getting excited. Oh, I actually know some French. And eventually I got some magazines as well in French, not about learning French, but just history magazines or things like that, things I'm interested in. And I started reading more and more. I started reading because I realized that French is actually quite easy to understand, written French. If you know English and or Spanish, French is pretty easy compared to other languages. And I started reading more, and eventually started going to the north. We call it the north, the northern Basque Country, uh, French side of the border, and I started buying books there and slowly reading them. And yeah, eventually I ended up reading lots of books in French, watching, listening to the radio and podcasts as well. I found some podcasts that were interesting, so I ended up understanding French really well. That was this part, the input part. Yeah, it's very easy. You just, if you know enough vocabulary, you start watching stuff, shows, you start listening to radio and podcasts, and you start reading, and eventually you understand everything. As long as you've memorized enough vocab. I wasn't memorizing vocab then. It's just similar enough to English and French that I know a lot of it already. I could recognize it. It looks similar enough for that, and so that made input easier. However, the problem was speaking. You can understand something, but if you uh, haven't practiced speaking, you won't do very well in conversation. So I could understand, but I couldn't speak well, and that was the state of my French for a while. Could understand well, I just couldn't speak. And then I ended up finding the language islands technique kind of by chance. I mean, it wasn't called language islands then. I didn't know it was called that. I just discovered it when experimenting, and I started using it. Language islands technique, which is writing down long list of sentences for every possible scenario. Yeah, you make a list of all the usual or likely scenarios, interactions you'll have with people, who you usually have, the conversations you usually have, all the topics you talk about, and you prepare a list of sentences for each one of those. And that's what I did. I wrote everything in English, translated everything with a translator, created a document in 2 columns, so I knew what everything. I mean, my French was already good enough to understand it when I read the sentences, but it's different to actually then recall it fast enough and be able to say it with good pronunciation, right? So I started reading it aloud over and over until I could say the sentences without much hesitation. Then I started looking at the English and translating, like hiding the French column and translating verbally, saying them aloud, translating the sentences aloud from English into French, uh, each one of the sentences until I could recall it correctly. And finally, I got that's the best exercise for fluency, for speaking fluency. If you practice translating verbally into the language and they'll self-correct, you notice where you're making your mistakes, you fix them, and also you learn to think in the language and speak. You won't take as long to come up with phrases. And the last thing, we're listening and repeating. The same sentences generated an audio file for them, and I listened and repeated the same sentences over and over again. This is also good for fluency, but you also acquire the natural rhythm, pace, pronunciation of the language, all of those things. Listen and repeat. It's a very mechanical, repetitive exercise, but it works. And it's as simple as this. This is all I did. Um, Classes didn't work, but if you know enough vocabulary, this will work for any language. As long as you know enough vocabulary, you should start doing a lot of, especially listening. Reading is not bad, but listening is much better. And then prepare your language islands. At least 1,000 sentences. You write them, translate them, and then repeat them aloud over and over and over again. Listen and repeat, read them aloud, and translate verbally into the language and self correct. And if you do all these things, you can speak French or any language fluently in a relatively short amount of time.